In our modern age where the drummer gets the tracks and he does his thing, and then the guitar player gets the tracks and they do their thing, and stuff gets passed around, but nobody's thinking about the record as a whole and how it gets put together. So it's usually pretty easy to tell when you listen to the rough mix, if someone's thought about the record or if they've just thought about the parts. When they've just thought about the parts, then I got to think about turning it into a record.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can go to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level. And you can start right now with my free introduction to mixing course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you are in Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or anything you can think of. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, or look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is John Paterno, a Grammy-winning Los Angeles-based producer, mixer, composer, engineer, mastering engineer, and musician who has worked with a diverse range of artists, including Robbie Williams, the Steve Gadd Band, Soraya, Robben Ford, Eros Ramazzotti, The Thrills, Tim McGraw, Bonnie Raitt, and Badly Drawn Boy, just to name a few, in his 25-plus year career. Dubbed Mr Meticulous by industry writer Mr Bonzai, Paterno is known for his attention to detail while at the same time allowing artists to feel uninhibited in their creativity. John moved to Los Angeles 2 weeks after graduation from the University of Miami, the music engineering program there, and a short period of freelance assisting concluded with a staff position at Sunset Sound Factory in Hollywood, where for 5 years he was exposed to many great engineers, producers, and artists. After breaking out of assisting, John worked with a wide range of producers, including Mitchell Froom, Joe Chicarelli, Byron Gallimore, Celso Valli, and Stephen Duffy. He won a Latin Grammy for his work with artist-producer Soraya, which, by the way, John, that is also my daughter's name.
Oh, wow.
I know. So what a trip to see that in your credits. John has produced or co-produced projects for the Black Mollies, Mitchell Froom, Lustra, Robbie Williams, the Lilac Time, and many other artists. He's also co-written songs with artists and has written pieces for TV and film. I recently met John at a breakfast out at Winter NAMM with Chad Blake and Andrew Sheps, and we had a great talk. John is super down to earth, and I'm looking forward to learning from John about making great records in the studio. Please welcome John Paterno to Recording Studio Rockstars. John, are you ready to rock, man?
I am ready to rock. Thanks so much for having me.
Dude, it's a pleasure. And Rockstars, we have a little bit of a video thing so that I'm seeing John's studio, and you just look super zen, dude. You're just sitting there cross-legged in this home studio surrounded by awesome racks of gear. Tell us where you are.
I'm in Culver City, and we've been here for a little while now. I'm in a little tiny room. It's only 7 feet by 11 feet. I've got a bunch of guitars stuffed in the closet and that kind of a thing, but it works. It works for my needs. And yeah, it's a nice vibe here. It really is.
Well, it looks cozy, and having been out at NAMM recently in Anaheim, California, I certainly appreciate the nice warm weather. Even though it's chilly at night, it's sort of desert climate, isn't it?
It is. It is. And it's been chilly since you've left here too. I mean, everything's relative. Granted, you probably went back to snow, but everything's relative. It's
not quite. I'm in Nashville, so we got a lot of rain.
Okay.
Almost got the studio flooded when I got back, actually.
Oh, no.
It's all about the gutters, man.
Yeah.
It's all about gutters.
Got to keep them clean.
If your gutters aren't clean, then the water spills out and then it comes back into your studio.
Oh.
All right, cool, man. Well, give us a little bit more of an introduction to who you are and how you got into recording. I can't remember if I mentioned this, but when we were talking at breakfast, you mentioned going to University of Miami. That's actually where my uncle, Tad Foote, was the president of University of Miami through the 80s and into the 90s as well. And so you probably
he was
there
president while I was there, yeah.
That's a trip, isn't it?
That's hysterical, yeah.
And I can't explain why it was that I didn't end up at University of Miami for the recording program, but I ended up down in Nashville for MTSU.
Okay, well, that was one of the few schools at the time. There was Miami, MTSU, North Texas, and Berkeley. I think those were the four around the time I was looking. And I got into it. I was going to be an electrical engineer. I was taking classes at community college and working at a music store at the time, and was really into this whole integration of systems, I think, more than anything else. I was doing electronic repairs at the music store, so I was kind of getting a feel for that as well. My dad never really wanted me to be a musician, although today he doesn't say that, but at the time he definitely said, he made it pretty clear. So this was in a weird way my way to get around that and kind of get into something. I had read about in Mix Magazine, the program, and saw that it was an engineering degree, talked to my dad about it. And so we went down to Miami at one point at one of the open houses, saw the place, and it seemed like a good place for me to go. The only caveat was you had to be proficient on an instrument, so it was the School of Music you had to get into. And I was the definition of how do you get a guitar player to turn down. You give them a chart. So I had fortunately had been doing a bunch of weird live sound corporate gigs that had these small rhythm sections and a couple of singers. And I would show up, set up the PA, run the monitors and the PA from the front of the house area, and then break it down at the end of the night. But a lot of the players were faculty members of Miami-Dade College and University of Miami. So I ended up meeting the guitar instructor on one of these gigs. So we had a chat, and he's like, well, you should call this guy. He's one of my best students. And his name is Brian Monroney. And so I literally took a 6-month crash course in jazz from Brian.
That's cool.
Somehow passed the audition and did 3 years at Miami before I moved out. Yeah.
Do you still play a lot of guitar now?
I do. I play more and more. My first probably 8 to 10 years here, I kind of just totally dove into the engineering thing. And when you're doing 80 or 100 hours a week for weeks at a time, when you do get the time off, it's like I would look at the guitar and it was just, I didn't really want to deal with it.
Right.
But as I got back into wanting to produce and get more involved on that end, then I started playing again more, just to get my harmony together again, to be able to relate ideas and stuff like that.
When I was starting out in the studio, Brad Jones was a mentor of mine, and I would watch him produce in the studio, and I was always fascinated by his ability to communicate through the glass to an artist, to hit the third and the seventh and stuff like that. And I was just like, man, how do you guys even know what that stuff is? Now, sometimes I scratch my head a little bit. And I wonder if the artist even actually knew what those notes were, but I think a lot of them did. A lot of the session players that he was talking to. Is that part of your language of producing? Do you talk about the notes and the scale and things like that?
Yeah, sometimes I do. And that's one of the most fascinating things to me about making records. It's trying to understand the artist's perspective, where they're coming from, and to find a way to come up with language from me to get my point across to them. Fortunately, I got to see a lot of people do a lot of things, and some of them were great and some of them weren't so great. There's one producer who I'd worked with a bunch where he'd hire a session player. Session player would come in, the tune would play down, and so session players just kind of figuring their way through it, right? Trying to learn the tune, trying to, get their headspace around it. And the producers was immediately saying, "Oh no, play the third in the bass on that." So and then go C, D, and then go E. And you could always feel the musician's shoulders just droop.
Oh man.
Every time. Because this was going to be one of those sessions where all they're doing is being dictated what it is they need to play. And they were pros, so they would make their way through it. But it's not like you got the best out of that person that you brought in. And, and you want to bring in these session players for their unique capabilities. So I had seen that a lot with this particular producer, and I vowed never, ever to do that. So, you got to let the musician kind of find their way into it.
Mm-hmm.
Even the greatest session musicians, I mean, they're going to need a little time. And if you're going to get the best out of them, and then once you go through the tune a couple of times, obviously, if you have a couple of ideas, then you find a way. But then again, if they play something cool, maybe you can build off what they did, and then and then base your comments on that, as opposed to just coming at them from left field.
So I totally hear you, and I agree, and I understand that it's one of those learning processes we can go through too as a producer of over managing what the musician is playing and overdoing it, and then I feel like the learning experience is you get in there, you're excited as a producer. You've got this, you're hearing this thing in your head, and you're just excited about it, And so you try and get everybody else excited, and they get excited with you, and then you push hard for this thing, and you get it, and then you get to the end, you play it back, and immediately you're like, "Ah, shit, man! It's not that great. I don't know. Maybe I should just, I shouldn't have said anything, And like that's the learning process, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, no doubt about it. And what I find that's even more challenging, and a lot of times in a good way, is that sometimes you think you have the right player for something, but they're not quite what you were expecting. And so finding a way to be able to edit them on the fly, and to be able to say things to so that they understand what you're coming from, and to push them as a player a little bit too, because you can't always get David Hidalgo or Greg Gleese or Mike Landau, on a session. It's just not physically possible or financially possible a lot of times.
Right.
So sometimes it's figuring out pretty quickly your players' strong points and weak points, and trying to take advantage of what they do well.
I agree that when you're on the control room side of the glass and you're listening, you hear a player do something and it inspires you, like, "Oh, that was so cool what you just did right there." And if we accept for a moment that your ideas as a producer are potentially pretty good ones, what do you feel like are some really good ways to hear what they're doing, get inspired, and feed it back to them, and actually work with the musician to create something that's super cool versus just stepping all over them like that producer you were talking about?
Well, the first thing you do is you hit record immediately when they start playing, because a lot of times they'll play something completely off the cuff, inspiring, and just randomly just finding their way through the tune. So always put the machine in record. There's no reason
listen,
not
right?
to.
And listen while they're playing.
Yeah, but mainly make sure you have it, because then you can go back immediately and say, "Hey, listen to what you did here. Check this out. And what if we take this, and what if we build on this a little bit?" And sometimes it could even be I don't want to say a wrong note, but it could be like an extension of the chord. It could be something that you normally wouldn't do, or they normally wouldn't do, but they're trying to figure out their way through the tune. And so there's some chord change. And so it becomes some weird bridge, right? Or some weird connectivity, right, between section to section.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important, if you're producing, to keep an ear out for those things. And it's a matter of being present. I mean, I'm sitting here zen, like you said, but there's something about that whole concept, right? This this being in the moment and being open and being willing to go down a path that you hear and that you react to. A lot of times I'm engineering and producing at the same time. So, I had a big joke with a lot of my musician friends because I can get sounds quickly. I can imagine them. I know what mics I want to use or how I want to get there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It just takes me a longer time to do performances because I just don't play as much. And I don't like to edit too much. I'd rather just get a great performance. So the time I take to get a quick guitar sound, it might take me 10 passes to get the feel and the sound I want while I'm playing. Whereas if I get one of my other guitar player friends to come over, we're going to have it in 1 or 2 takes.
Right.
But they would have spent way more time getting a guitar sound that worked to make it work into their scene. So, so the good part is when I'm producing is that I don't have to worry about the performance and the technical end, on that end as well. All I have to do is listen. And sometimes that's difficult though, because you get distracted. Your phone's going off or some other things going on around you, right? I mean, that's what the biggest thing I miss about, I don't want to say the old days, but when you used to have 6 weeks to make a record in a studio, right? So you had this daily thing, you went, you showed up. People weren't Instagramming all the time and people didn't have phones out and taking pictures. It was like, they showed up and they worked.
Yeah.
And they thought about things.
At worst, they were reading tape op in the back of the control room, right?
Exactly. So, yeah.
Or something else.
Or something else. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you talking about like performing and producing. I find that for myself, if I'm playing a part, I have a tendency to just keep doing a bunch of performances because I also know that I can piece it together. And like if I do a guitar overdub myself, I might finish the session with 25 takes of the guitar. Mm-hmm. But it's cool because the last handful are probably the ones that I'm going to reach to. The last one might be the best anyway. But those early takes could be really useful because maybe I had just the right feedback going into the intro and that was a cooler one or whatever,
Right. No, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because then you spend the 25 takes to do it and then you've got to sort through the 25 takes later on. Yeah. And that's the thing that I just can't stand doing that. I would much rather be reactionary in the moment and say yes, no. It's way harder when you're playing and trying to critique yourself as well. I will totally give you that.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest part about playing and doing it all yourself, right? Because you're kind of critiquing yourself as you're playing. I used to watch singers do that all the time. There's one person in particular who she's a great singer. But she would be singing and then she'd stop because she'd hear something that she did that was off and she didn't like it. It was distracting to her.
Right. So she wouldn't keep going.
Right. So, we as players and if we're self-producing and, we all have that tendency to do that. It's really hard to just let go and to trust yourself and to trust the process that, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it until it feels right. And then I'm going to stop. And I'm not saying that I don't have 5 or 10 takes of something because there's always that fear that you bring to is like, oh my God, I'm going to miss something. And once you identify that as fear and that it's just, that's all it is. Right. And okay, how can I phrase this so it makes sense? Once you identify it, that it's just this fear, then you can kind of call it what it is. And then you can just kind of get over it. So, okay, I'm just afraid. That's all.
Right.
So I can let me just be confident and let me approach this confidently and let me keep going that way. And, you hear that in a lot of recordings. You hear the conservatism, you hear the fact that people are a little wound up when they're doing stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's because everybody's afraid of making a mistake. And, my favorite records were not about that at all. They were about going for it. And in studying a lot of records, you start to glean that, and working with great musicians, you glean that as well. I mean, David Hidalgo from Los Lobos. I mean, that guy can hit the top of a cabinet and it would be the most musical thing you've ever heard in your entire life. So,
what's is David the drummer? Is he the what is
David's
his
he's the right-handed guitar player and the other singer. So like Caesar's the lefty and he sings, and then David's the righty and he sings as well. He's the tallest one out of the guys.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned him. So let's jump back a little bit and let's talk about some of the first people you worked with, which were Tchad Blake and Mitchell Froom, and working with Los Lobos. Pretty awesome stuff. Tell us the story about working with those guys and working with Los Lobos. Colossal Head is one of my absolute favorite records ever, and there it is in your credit list.
Well, okay. The short version is I got put on the session with Tchad and Mitchell because none of the other assistants wanted to work with Tchad because Tchad did everything by himself. And so I actually wanted
Sound?
This is actually at Sound Factory, right? So at the time, Sunset Sound owned Sound Factory. So there were 3 studios at Sunset Sound, 2 at Sound Factory. So there were 5 rooms. So there were 5 staff assistants there.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but was Sound Factory, when I pulled into the parking lot, was Sound Factory the building to the right?
No, Sound Factory was a completely different building. It was on Selma Avenue, where Sunset Sound is on Sunset Boulevard.
Right. Okay.
So it was like a 3-minute drive. It's like 3 blocks east to a block north of Sunset Boulevard, something like that.
So you were over at Sunset Sound assisting on with Tchad at that point.
Well, at Sound Factory. Yeah. So so the assistants floated between Sunset Sound and Sound Factory. And what happened a lot of times is you ended up, because of the scheduling, you ended up in one room a lot or one building a lot. So I spent the majority of my time at Sound Factory. So basically I got put on this session, was told to bring a good book. And here it's a session for 6 weeks, but a couple of things happened. First, I was determined not to sit on my butt for that amount of time.
Yeah.
And then the second thing was the Los Lobos guys never showed up on time. They had 2 jokes that they'll be there between noon and 5 sharp. And the Lobos clock has no hands. And they put out a record called This Time. And if you look at the cover, it's got a clock on it. And if you look at the cover, the clock has no hands on it. So
that's great. Kind
of an inside joke from, that they brought to fruition later on. So that gave me time every day, Tchad and I, to just hang out. And we came from very different backgrounds, but we both had this love for the Beatles. And he was really into the White Album. And I remember sitting there listening to the White Album with him, for like an hour or 2 every day, waiting for the band to show up. So we became friendly kind of off the bat. And then the other thing that happened was I wanted to participate. And he and Mitchell both appreciated that. So they would be talking about an overdub and I'd lean in and say, what kind of mic you want to use? Where do you want it set up? And I guess nobody else had really done that for him because he did everything by himself.
What year was this?
91.
Okay. So at this point, Rockstars, Nirvana had just come out with Smells Like Teen Spirit. There was a noticeable shift in the music industry, but we were still just finishing out with the 80s and, big, super produced hair metal and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then, and Mitchell had come off doing the Crowded House records. He had worked with Paul McCartney. He had worked with the Pretenders. And he and Tchad had done some of this stuff together. Actually, most of it together, most of the things I've just mentioned. And I might have the chronology a little bit wrong, but all these things were going on with them around the same time. Mm-hmm. And then at some point, I think they decided they really just wanted to go for something different. And I think Kiko was that record when they decided that's it. And so I was there for it. I was there for all of it. And it was pretty cool. And the second tune on that record, it's called Wake Up Dolores. And Kevin Killen recorded that record.
Oh, cool.
And because Tchad went to India, so Mitchell flew Kevin in and cut that. And then also, most people don't realize this, but there's an engineer named Paul Dugray who did a bunch of recording on that record as well. And it's all credited properly. But he had done a tracking on, I don't know how many tunes, but so we were putting up tapes of his, and then Tchad was doing his thing to those sounds. And then Tchad ended up mixing the whole record. So there were a few different stages of that.
Well, so what were some of the things that you remember being struck by how Tchad would make sounds? You know, what were, you know, did you feel like you came to this with a preconceived idea of how recording was supposed to be done at that point, and then you had a shift or anything like that?
Well, of course I did, because I came from music school where, of course, you know everything when you come out, right? Just like anybody that comes from a music school or a recording school. I had a year of freelance assisting before that. So I had been exposed to a few different people at that point. But what struck me about Tchad was his focus. I mean, he just had a laser beam, and he was just so committed to getting it right and to getting it quickly. And you know, I've said this before, you know, a lot of his thing, you know, people know him for kind of getting these kind of messed up, trashy, distorted, crazy sounds, but even his basic sounds, I mean, he's a great engineer. And so he took these great engineering skills that he had learned and developed, and then just kind of turned it on its ear and did his own thing, right? In a very, very artistic way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the great things about when he and Mitchell worked together, because Mitchell is more of an economist and a scientist, and I don't mean that in a bad connotation. I mean, Mitchell, I think he just thinks about music in a different way. He thinks about it as I think this puzzle that he's trying to figure out. Mm-hmm. And again, like complete thought process going on with him as well. So you had these two guys who had these really kind of strong opinions about things, but yet they were kind of in their own separate worlds. Like Tchad was focused on the sound, Mitchell was focused on the harmony and on the arrangements. So
yeah, that's a good combination.
It was really, really cool to see. And even then fortunately I was smart enough just to kind of observe it all, and because I was involved too, it wasn't like I had any kind of, it's not like I was sitting in the corner brooding, you know. I was like, you know, I was patching headphones. I felt like I was part of the process. So I think that really, that really shifted my point of view and really helped me at that point as well.
Now, did you feel like you understood what was going on enough to know what kind of routing Tchad might have been doing for the sounds? Or did you, do you have any stories you remember about some particular thing Tchad did? You know, let's throw out the obvious ones. Like, did you see a level lock there or a devil lock? Did you see the, did you see a Sans amp in use and go like, oh, that's an interesting way to do something?
Oh, yeah. Well, Kiko was, I believe, the first record where he actually used the Sans amp. So I saw him while he was figuring out what to do with it, and his applications of it. So awesome. Yeah, a lot of that creative stuff. I mean, he had done stuff before that, don't get me wrong, but putting metal pipes in front of a kit with a microphone in it.
Right.
I think he bought the level lock within the first year or two of me working for him. So he didn't even have it for Kiko. I'm not even sure when he bought it and when it got pressed into use, because he used to use it when he mixed as well. It wasn't just for tracking. I have some mix notes that I found recently, and Devil Lock Level Lock, is listed as a return, as an effects return. So
yeah. I know I mix up the names too, because I guess Devil Lock is what we have now from Sound Toys, the plug-in version, right? Yeah,
exactly, which is super cool.
Oh, by the way, so there was somebody at the breakfast we had at NAMM who brought a Level Lock to breakfast, and then Tchad signed it with a Sharpie.
Yeah, guy named Ben. Yep. Yeah, definitely.
That was great. What a great detail. Yep. I remember also hearing a story. I mean, these are questions I could ask Tchad myself, but a story from Brad saying, and maybe it had to do with Chad's trip to India, where Brad said, he went over there, and when they would do the imams would do the singing in the villages, they would use these tube PAs, and apparently he bought and brought back a tube PA system from there and brought that into the studio.
It wasn't tube. It was solid state. It was definitely solid state. It had a built-in cassette player, and it was called the Ahuja, Ahuja.
That's awesome.
And yeah, he used it a ton.
That's great.
Yeah, he brought it back, and he used it on Suzanne Vega's 99.9. That, I believe that was the first record he used it on.
Is that part of the kind of filtered vocal sound or anything like that?
Yeah, filtered vocal sound, and he ran all kinds of stuff through it, right? So he'd just run it out there, and he'd put a mic on it.
That's great, man.
And record it back in. Oh, yeah, totally. And I think it had a built-in echo, too. So I think he used that as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Other things I remember people bringing back from India later, probably late 90s, were these little boxes that would do sort of self-programmed sitar drones and tabla beats and things like that. I
have one.
Why is there so much cool stuff being made in India for us to make records with? It goes all the way back to the Beatles, right?
Exactly. No, I actually have one of those, the little drone. Nah.
That's great. Well, all right. So let's fast forward a moment. Here you are, you're learning to be a great recording engineer and get great sounds, but then also learning how to completely screw with those sounds and get creative with it. What are some of the things that you've carried forward for yourself? Do you like to screw with the sounds? Do you find that you don't do that as much now and you really just focus on sort of getting the pure tones out of the microphones? Any thoughts on that?
It's all context related for me. And, Mitchell did an interview one time about a Joan Osborne record that I had done with him. And, he compared me to Tchad for a moment. And basically he just said that he thought I was a little bit more conservative and like I wasn't quite as aggressive as Tchad, but he obviously liked my engineering because he hired me for a bunch of things for a while. For me, it's context related. And so my focus tends to be a little bit more about what's going on in the room and what the players are like, as opposed to, and this is no slight on Tchad, but, or anybody, right, that's got a lot of personality and a serious artistic bent, I probably am a little bit more conservative in that way, where I want to capture more of the performance and the sound and the vibe in the room, right? Maybe I am a bit more of a realist than maybe he is in the end. But if I feel like a record is lacking in some way, though, I have no problem going for it. And let the music call for the engineering. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's funny. One of the two best pieces of advice I've ever gotten from anybody was Kevin Killen said to me, "Never take a gig just for the money."
Good advice.
So at one point I got a call about doing a record, and the producer has me on the phone and he's like, "Yeah, we just want somebody who can fuck up drums like Tchad Blake." And I'm like, "Well, then I'm not your guy." It's like, "Well, what do you mean? You work with Tchad all this time." I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm not going to gratuitously just throw a piece of distortion on your record just to do it." I said, "That's not what I do." I said, "If you want what Tchad does, hire Tchad. But I'm not going to just sit there and just distort your record just to distort your record without any context." I mean, I didn't say it that elegantly. I just kind of said no. I hung up the phone. And then they called me back and they're like, "Well, no, we really do want you to do it. But we have this much money." And I was just like, "Nope." I hung up the phone. Oops. Sorry.
Oh man, what a trip. Well, Kevin Killen's been on the show too. And he was awesome, dude. What a great guy.
He's fantastic.
And that's a great quote, because it is a tough one. It's a challenging one, especially when you go into the decision to make records for a life. It's a hard road. There's a lot of, there's not a lot of money on that journey. And so to be in a position where you feel confident saying no to things that pay.
Well, but I ended up doing the record because they came back and offered me a shitload more money.
Okay, great. Awesome.
And I'm just like, okay, this is like, I'm like, okay, this is a month of my time. And I fucking hated it. There were things going on outside the studio too. It was a really weird time for me. And I just thought, okay, look, I'm just going to throw myself into this. And it was just dumb. And the record, at the end, the record sold pretty well, and you know, but I never worked with that producer again, and I never worked with the band again, and I'm fine with it.
Yeah,
because it was just lame, and yeah.
Well, the funny thing about working for money and taking gigs for money is if you zoom out with your perspective a little bit, sometimes you can realize that all you're doing is you're just time shifting. You're taking like, here I am, here's my needs, here's a gig for money that's going to take a month. And if I take it, really all I'm doing is I'm shifting the now to a month later, and I'll be right back in the same situation potentially. All I will have done is just kind of delayed, you know, put a delay on my time for a little bit and work on this crappy thing to just earn money.
Yeah, but you can pay your mortgage, or you can pay off the bill, or you can buy that piece of gear. I mean, you know, so I mean, you know, there is weighing to it, but I mean, here's the thing: it's not like 8 hours and you go home. It's more like 12 or 16 hours. And I mean, the good thing about any of those records at that point were just like, okay, you knew there was an end date because you knew there was a budget, and you knew that they were going to run out of money at some point. And the best part is, like, after we got done, and they wanted me to work a few more days, and I said no. But they're like, oh, we're going to do strings and horns, and, you know, can you do that? And I said, yeah. And then so we had a string section in, and we had a real conductor, and they were amazed at how fast the session went and how well it went.
Because you had great players too, and great engineer.
Well, yeah, but it just wasn't you guys arguing about song lyrics, or somebody playing a flat 7 and somebody else playing a major 7.
Yeah.
You know, at the same time. So sorry, it's getting into the technical stuff again, right? But or the musical notes, but that's what was happening, song after song after song, and it was a bunch of dudes arguing with each other, and it's just like I didn't need to be around that energy.
Well, I certainly had that experience myself, and there was a year-long record that I accepted because in my gut, I knew it wasn't what I wanted to do, but it was the right money at the right time when I had a family to support and feed, and I made that choice. And then it didn't really seem to have an end in sight. And I kept, same thing. I'd get a call from management or label or somebody who was like, if you could just hang in there and if you could just power through this weekend. I know you said you had some 3-day thing scheduled off in advance, but if you could just keep working, it'd be great. And I'd be like, okay, all right, I'll take one from the team. And then in the end of the day, I was like, there really is no team.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's a funny thing, I mean, the good part, at least at that time, was you knew it was going to end, and you can tough it out for a month or for 6 weeks or something. But yeah, I mean, a year long, and so with the demise of budgets comes this, you have the quality cost time triangle, pick two. Mm-hmm. So now things are getting extended so much that it's even kind of a bit more critical to kind of pick your battles, because now, yeah, it's going to get stretched out even longer. And then someone's going to call you about a mix you did a year ago, and they were going to want to make one little tweak, and yeah, and honestly, it wasn't that good then. And this little tweak now is not really going to make it that much better. And there's usually a bunch of other issues associated with it that have nothing to do with the actual work that you've done, and it's there. So
it's one of the nice things about the new music industry now, and the smaller budgets and the smaller time frames, is that, a lot of times you really benefit from just kind of getting down to work, making music quickly and making your record quickly and getting it out the door. And particularly maybe even making decisions about, hey, we're going to really lean on performance because we'll get more great work done quickly that way than, edit this to death too.
Right. Well, I don't see that as much. Honestly, I see people who are, they're really leery about getting stuff finished and getting it out the door. And it's, I actually miss those days. I mean, I'm not saying I never get to work on records like that, but a lot of times it's like stuff that it just sits, and then they're just waiting, and then they're going out on the road, and then they're coming back, and then before you know it, a year goes by, and that stuff gets stale too. Yeah. I mean, people get bored with their own music. So there is something to be said, even if it is a limited budget, to get in, do it, get it out the door. Sorry, I keep hitting my pop filter.
Right. So see if the rock stars can hear it by the time I'm done mixing. Maybe that's a sign of budgets being too small, where it's possible for artists and bands to just keep chipping away at a project instead of really hunkering down with it. But let's take a break for just a second. We'll come back in for the jam session, and I'm going to really dig into some questions about recording, how you like to do stuff, and awesome. And some of the records you've done. So Rockstars, reminder, we've got links to what we're talking about in the show notes. Just click through on your mobile device, or if you're on your desktop, go to rsrockstars.com and find the blog post with everything in it there. And also I have a YouTube playlist where I've included a bunch of John's work, and so you can just click through and listen right there as well. And if you're listening to this on YouTube right now, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the like button and notification bell so you get more of this. And drop in a comment and let us know if, any of your thoughts about making records. John, do you have any questions for the rock stars you want them to answer if they drop a comment in on this video? What's the first thought that comes to you for wondering who our listeners are?
The first thought that comes to me is priority, performance or sound, or what percentage performance or sound.
Okay, so like what percentage do you rock stars feel like is part of making your records, more performance versus the sound quality, or just the sound itself?
Yeah, or the sound or the way it's put together, I guess.
Okay.
I know it might be a bit esoteric, but that's what comes to mind, because that's our juxtaposition, right? And a lot of people say, oh, it's got to be 100% performance. Well, in a perfect world, yes, but in a practical world, you still have to put up a microphone. You still have to kind of, know your craft and know your tools enough. So that's kind of what I'm getting at, I think, by the question.
All right, dig it. Well, we'll see you guys in just a minute for the jam session. This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you are ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I mastered my own record, Skadoosh, using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. These techniques would work for you in whichever DAW you are using right now. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads to mix in your own studio, and even include in your mixing portfolio if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey, rock stars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is John Paterno, joining us from Culver City, California, from his studio. John, are you ready to jam?
Let's go. Ready to jam.
All right, cool, man. Let's dive right in and talk about how to make records, the fun stuff. You know, one of the artists that you worked with is the Steve Gadd Band. And and I know that you have both a background in study of jazz, but also a background in recording jazz as well. And, you know, here we talked a little bit about the process with Tchad of recording sort of a pure recording sound, but then also taking artistic liberties with really screwing with sounds with sans amps and stuff. Talk to us about your approach to recording jazz bands, because I find that with traditional jazz, sometimes when we get an opportunity to record it, we realize we're like, wow, I really need to like bring my A game as an engineer and not screw this thing up. So what to you is different or similar about recording jazz versus rock and kind of songwritery music?
Well, with jazz, the first thing is that most of the time the players are way, way better. So in some ways it's easier because you're not having to deal with people who are overhitting their instruments or people who aren't playing in tune or people who can't play in time, right? So
and if they can't, you can't tell because it's jazz anyway.
Now, don't be too hard on the jazzers.
No, come on, Lidge.
As long as they don't try to play blues or think they can play rock, then that's fine. You know, as long as they stay in their own, everybody stays in their own lane in that sense.
Rock doesn't have a lot of room for the seven.
But back to what you said, sometimes you need a little spice. I mean, sonic spice to kind of make the whole thing come alive. And circling back to what we were talking about, Tchad, what stayed with me from working with Tchad, right? There's a couple of microphone things. And one of them, Tchad always put a mono mic really close to the kit. And he put a bunch of compression on it in some way. You know, he'd have like 3 or 4 different things that he would use over time. So I still do that same thing, and I do it with every drum kit I set up. So the Steve Gadd record that I did, you know, I set up the mics. I've got a Soundfield mic that I love to use as drum overheads, and I don't really care if it's, it doesn't matter, jazz, rock, whatever. I just love what it does.
Maybe you should just tell the rock stars what the Soundfield mic is, because it's a pretty unusual beast.
Yeah, it's a 4-capsule microphone. And when you look at them, they're pointed in very odd seeming directions, but they have a processor box and they are electronically combined in the processor box. So you can do, you can manipulate it in a variety of ways. Like you can literally steer the microphone left to right. You can add ambience into the microphone or you can make it more direct just by sitting in the control room. It's got like a 75-foot cable on it, and it's a multi-pin. It's like a 40 or 50-pin cable.
Good Lord.
Yeah, no, it's super cool. I bought it originally to do string dates, and then I wanted to try it on drums one day, and I loved it. And that's become my drum overhead, and that's pretty much what I use on 90% of the things I do, unless I go for like a Glyn Johns kind of, technique.
Well, Glyn Johns didn't have a Soundfield mic.
No, and if he had one, I wonder if he would have just used that instead.
So what are some of the, like, why do you want all this manipulation? What are some use cases where you make adjustments and you're like, oh, I'm glad I was able to do that?
Well, it's more, I mean, technically you can record each capsule separately, and then you can manipulate it later on, which I've never done. I'm an of the moment person.
Yeah.
What's nice is to be in the control room and go, oh, well, the kick feels a little left heavy or right heavy. Now, when I do overheads, I don't go straight over the bass drum. I actually go from the side over the ride, and I make sure that the XY plane, I have the kick and the snare in the center. So It looks fun. It looks, it's not over the bass drum in front. It's actually off to the side. And this way, the kick and the snare always stay in the center. It's not like the snare feels off to the right-hand side. So sometimes if they're not feeling in the center and I've set up the microphone, then sometimes I'll tweak it a little bit. Sometimes if I think I want more ambience on a particular tune, I can actually dial in a little more overhead ambience as opposed to keeping it more direct. There's an elevation control too that's supposed to give you, the illusion of more height.
Really? Wow.
Sometimes I hear it, sometimes I don't. And I mean, a lot of times if there's not a pass through into the control room for cables, then I just leave the processor box out near the mic. So I just run back and forth and make a couple of adjustments because it's a line level out. It's built-in mic pre and that kind of a thing.
It's good to get out of our chair in the studio anyway.
Absolutely. So sound fields on everything, but also always this mono compressed mic I have on everything. The Gadd record, depending on the song, I moved it around. Sometimes it was in front of the kit. Sometimes it was inside, really close to the kick and the snare. And it just really depended on the tempo of the tune and what we were going for. And I would just make a quick decision. Because that record, nobody counted off and said, okay, let's record. Basically, they were learning the tune. Sometimes they were writing the tune. And once they would work it up, I would be like, okay, it sounds like and feels like they're about ready to do a take. So I would just put the machine in a record. And invariably within, a minute, 30 seconds, they would start playing the tune and then we'd get it. And then they'd just say, okay. And they'd come in and listen. Never any communication about that. Mm-hmm. One tune caught me. One tune I missed the very beginning. But fortunately, they did a really long vamp. And on the record, we just faded it up at the beginning.
Nice, man. Tell the rock stars also who Steve Gadd is.
Well, Steve Gadd is actually he just won a Grammy for the last record he did. Just
very cool.
I think I did the very first one. This was his third one, and he just won it the other night. So Steve Gadd is he's a legendary drummer, right? I think he's in his early 70s at this point. He was the drummer on The Hustle. Wow. Come on. Look up that tune if you don't know it. He was the drummer for Paul Simon on 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover and things like that. He's played on a million records. He's played with Steely Dan. He tours a lot with Clapton. He's James Taylor's drummer right now. He's been touring with James for a long time. And he's just this phenomenal player.
Yeah.
And the rest of the band are no slouches either. The record I worked on was Jimmy Johnson on bass, Walt Fowler on trumpet, Larry Goldings on keyboard, and Michael Landau, who's one of my favorite guitarists on the planet. I mean, it doesn't get much better than Mike. So
that's cool, man. That's cool. All right. Well, let's go back to the geeky stuff here for a sec.
Sure.
The mono mic. Help the rock stars understand what are some cool directions to go? Which mic in their collection should they try out as a mono mic? How should they treat it? How do you approach this? How do you make sure it works with the other mics on the drum kit?
Well, okay. That's a lot of questions all at once there,
dude,
man.
I got so many questions.
All right. I'm ready to roll. I usually use a dynamic mic. Tchad used to use a 441 a lot. And regardless of what mic I use, I always label it 441 on my tracks.
Cool.
And so here's the thing. You want a mic that's got a pretty even frequency response most of the time, but you don't want it to be too hypey. Because once it starts grabbing the cymbals, because it'll grab everything once you put the compression on it.
Right.
But once it starts grabbing the cymbals, you want to make sure it's not going to cut your head off. The nice thing about the 441 is it's got good rear rejection. So it stays pretty focused in front. That said, an AKG D19 sounds amazing, but it's trashy and it's going to be on the thinner side because those mics have no low end. Mm-hmm. An EV RE15 is really cool. What else do I use?
Dang, I've got an RE10 and an RE16. I've got a gap in the middle there.
Try both of them. And that's the other thing, man. Just try stuff. Try an Omni. A 57 will work, in there as well. And I try to get it in right over the bass drum, pointing at the snare drum. Or I'm sorry, I get it right over the bass drum, pointing between the edge of the bass drum and the snare drum. So I don't point it directly at the snare. But then again, it depends on how the drummer plays. If they have a weak snare, which doesn't really happen very often anymore, but every once in a while you get somebody with kind of a weak snare. So then I'll point it a little bit more towards the snare. But the thing is, I face it down, and it literally just absorbs everything from the kit. And even though a lot of the sounds are off axis, you're getting tone out of it. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty interesting how much it can actually just fill in a sound. So you have separate kicks, snare, toms, overheads, right? So you have this kind of really sometimes a pristine tone, right? But everything feels distinct.
Right.
So when you blend in this mono mic, it kind of glues everything together. Obviously, you want to check the polarity to make sure that one way or the other it's better, right? That things still sound distinct and they don't sound muddy. But then, running it through a compressor, and I usually print it with the compressor because I usually just get the sound as I go.
Yeah, and I mean, I would ask this: mm-hmm. Does it even sound worth listening to without the compressor? Is that just like
it can be actually really cool without the compressor? It's an interesting tonal thing. I don't know that I would use it as my only mic, although it might work. Again, context is everything, right? Yeah. So there may be an occasion where just recording it straight won't be a problem. As a matter of fact, one of the records we linked was this guy called Andrew Sinowick. And we had two drummers that we recorded at the same time. And I had 5 mics on each kit. I had a stereo overhead, I had a kick and a snare, and I had a mono mic, this exact thing that I'm talking about. One kit had an RE15, the other kit had an AKG D19. And when I tracked them, I didn't compress. I don't think I put compression on it because I didn't have the stuff there that I wanted to use. So I didn't compress them until I got back to my place. But I'm pretty sure I used compression on both of them.
Now, what was that record again?
Andrew Sinowick is his name. And he's this really great guitar player. And I'd been talking to him about doing a record for a long time, and he asked me to help him out with this one. And it's really cool. It's like, it's got the vibe of like the Allman Brothers in some ways, but there's actual really cool chord changes in it. And it's this kind of nice melding between rock and jazz to keep going back to this jazzish kind of theme as well.
Dig it. Cool, man.
But usually I like to compress that mic with either a distressor or with an 1176 with a couple of buttons pushed in, to get that crunchy kind of mode. But I've used Spectrasonic 610s on it. I've used guitar pedals. Sometimes you run it through like a Dynacomp or some other kind of cool guitar compression pedal. It works as well. So there are a lot of options for that.
Very cool, man. Well, that's really exciting. And I mean, I think it's just a good reminder that we need to start experimenting on that right away, because you have to try a lot of stuff before you begin to understand what it's going to do and which one of these tools you want to use and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And the other thing too is not being too precious about it all. You go for it, try things. That's how you're going to learn. Chad reminded me of something at that breakfast that I hadn't thought about, but he said, "Oh yeah, we used to do mic of the day."
Good deal. I like that.
Where we
need that
literally
kind of stuff.
Okay, this is what we're using today, and we used it on every overdub we did. KM86, KM84, RE20, 57.
I could see a couple of thoughts come to mind about that. So when you have the opportunity to work in a studio that has a console, mm-hmm. Which was traditionally how we made records, and then, would be in maybe well, I don't want to say it's unusual now, but it might be unusual for some people now because we live in this world of lots of racks of outboard mic pre's and everything, which that whole world kind of evolved out of the 90s and the 2000s because consoles were torn apart and turned into individual racks of gear. But when you do work on a console, you have the opportunity to record everything using similar mic pre's, and you begin to discover, I think, that can actually glue a record together in a cool way. Do you feel that could be the effect of using a same mic, or do you feel like we also run the risk of too much of certain hype frequencies and stuff like that?
Well, if you're trying to do it from a more purist kind of perspective, and not EQ, then you're going to get the tonality of the mic a little bit more. But if you got an EQ on that channel and you're not afraid to take out 4 dB at 400 hertz or add 6 dB at 10K just to make the sound right with your context, then I don't think the mic is quite as critical, or that kind of build-up thing is quite as critical.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but there is something to be said for running everything through the console. Although I have to say, even working on consoles, I mean, you can see me, and I've got outboard mic pre's and stuff. Like I've got 4 Chandler LTD ones that are Neve style modules, and I bought those because I just loved them on drums. Yeah. So they were my kick and snare pre's, working on an API console. And I didn't, Tchad had 4 1084s, and I'd asked to borrow them at one point on a demo I was doing because I had never used them before. And it was just like that, throw up the fader and in 10 seconds you have a drum sound, because it was just that sound that you had heard on so many records, right? So when the time came, I opted to get these for a few different reasons, and I love them, and I still use them. I still drag them to every tracking date I do.
Well, very cool. What are some other things that you've learned about recording jazz? So if I was just going to throw questions at you, you've talked about drums some. Oh, let me ask you this question about drums. Kick drums. How do we avoid that modern clicky kick when we don't want it on our recordings?
You pull the mic out. You don't stick the mic down in the you don't put it down the throat of the drum. You don't mic the beater. The Gadd record, I had a D112 out front. It wasn't even in the sound hole, right? It was even just, I think, a foot or so out front. And again, so here's the thing. You have to ask yourself what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do a jazz record, do you want it, if it's smooth jazz, you're going to probably want all the clicky because you want it to sound like that cross between jazz and pop. If you want to do something more traditional jazz, then you have to think about, well, what's going to take the weight of the bottom end? Where do you need a really big bass drum in that case? And probably not. You probably don't need something swallowing up the low end. You'll let the bass guitar take the low end, especially if they're playing a 5-string or something. Right. Or even an upright, right? You might want to let that actually take the low end and fill out the bottom end. And the other thing is, listen to the damn kit in the room. Don't immediately just sit there and push up faders in the control room without listening, because there's so much to be gleaned by standing there and hearing somebody play. And if your goal is to get it to sound like it sounds in the room, in the control room, then that's your first step. And if there are weird sounds in the room, those weird sounds are going to end up on your record. So deal with the weird sounds out in the room, right? When you're using a microphone, you're in an acoustic space. Find the right place in the room for the drums. That's the other thing too. A lot of people miss. I have drummers show up, or I have drum tech show up for sessions, and I always insist that I'm there when the drummer shows up to set up the kit, or the tech, because I want to place the kick and the snare where I want them placed.
Talk about that process. How do you start out with a kick and a snare and find the right placement?
Well,
in
it's funny.
a
This
studio.
is something I got, in working with Joe Chicarelli. This is something I saw him do, and I don't think he even does it anymore. But basically because where he works, he knows where he wants it to go. But
Right.
but I have him set up the kick and the snare, and I think, okay, let's try it here, and kick, snare, and a drum throne. And I have him hit the kick and the snare, and I listen, and I mark it on the floor with tape where the bass drum is. And then I'm like, okay, move it over 3 feet or 2 feet, or move it forward a foot. I move it some other place, and I listen. And I try like 2 or 3 places. And one place, usually suddenly the whole room starts singing. Like the low end sounds great, it feels great. It's not too boomy. Everything's speaking nice because I've hit a spot in the room that's exciting the room in a good way. And so you put your mics around that, and then everything that sounds good about the room is going to end up in all your microphones.
Nice.
So it's almost like cheating. And the times that I don't do that, or the times where where either I don't have the opportunity or it's just a rush job or something like that, I always wonder if I'm getting the best sound I can get, because I haven't gone through this little process. But the best part is watching the drum techs or the drummer's eyes light up when you find the right spot, because suddenly it's like it sounds better to them too, right? So another plus is like now you have a happy musician, somebody who's like digging their sound.
We're not dealing with microphones and headphones yet. We're just out in the room listening to the instrument with our bass, with our ears. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Cool.
Exactly.
And I think that a reminder to us is how easy it is to do that if it was just the human voice or walking around with an acoustic guitar. I'll do that sometimes in my studio where I just walk around hearing my own voice in an acoustic strum, and it's like, wow, it's remarkable. Huge differences in different places of the studio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And all that stuff ends up in your microphone.
Yeah. All right, cool.
It just does.
And then another bit of encouragement is I remember doing a record where we did one song and I just used one big diaphragm mic on the drums, and that was it. And then later on when we're mixing, I'm like, why does this one sound so much better than all the others, for the drum sound? And I would encourage you rock stars to, rediscover how to record drums by doing what John's saying, move the drums around in the space, and then just take one mic and with your ears find a spot and then put that mic there and try it out. You might be like, okay, I don't need that's it. It's great. Yeah. I'm not cheating just because it was easy to record the drums.
Exactly. That's why this Andrew Sinowick thing, 5 mics on a kit, it was actually really fun to do. It's just a pair of overheads, like I said, kind of minimal stuff. I didn't mic the toms. I didn't mic the room. I just let all the drum bleed between both drummers. I had the drummers set up 6 feet in front of each other too, in the same room.
Oh, cool. Right on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so let's jump forward. Next one, you talked about bass, 5-string or upright. Let's start with the tough question. How do we record upright bass?
That is always an interesting one. Because the sound can vary so much by the player. I like using like a U67 style mic and I usually mic it toward the bridge, because that's where you get a lot of the fundamental tone from. And then sometimes, and then usually there's a second mic that I put up either up near the fingers of the left hand, just because it tends to add a little bit more ambience and a little more roundness to the sound. And that can sometimes be a small diaphragm condenser, like an AKG 451 or a KM86 or a KM84, something like that, just to capture a little bit more detail, because I do that with acoustic guitars as well, that style of thing. And then if there's a DI available, I always take the DI, because you just never know if that's going to be useful later on.
It can really save your ass sometimes too.
Yeah. And if you're going to manufacture a sound, that's the way to do it later on if you have to.
So now this is probably an unfair question, but were you still working with Tchad when he was doing the Soul Coughing records?
Oh yeah, I was the assistant on Ruby Room.
Oh
Yeah.
man.
Yep.
So what would you say about that? I mean, that's one of the coolest upright bass sounds ever.
Hmm. Oh, that was amped.
Yeah.
So
So
that was a
what?
DI, and I don't remember what amp Sebastian used, but we mic'd the amp, and so that sound is a combination of the DI and the mic'd amp.
Very cool. So it's like blow off the mics on the instrument, get the sound coming out of the amp just right, and go from
Exactly.
there.
Well, that was part of the band's sound, and I mean, again, like here's a context thing, right? It's like that's what they did. It wasn't about the pristine sound of the bass. There was the sound of Sebastian doing that wonderful thing that he does, and that thing at that time was through the amp.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
totally.
Rockstars, if you haven't heard Ruby Vroom, I'll throw that in the YouTube playlist as well. But Soul Coughing, what a cool band. Cool, super cool, man.
Tracked in like 10 days and mixed in a week. Done.
It was performance stuff. And then that was sort
Guys
of,
were on fire.
the introduction of this concept of, the samples being part of the sound of a record too, but performed live. Do you want to tell us what that was?
That was the keyboard player Mark. He kind of worked up this concept of literally taking little snippets of music and samples and things and incorporating them in a compositional way into the record. So you had this upright bass, and then you had this really funky groove oriented drummer, and then you had Mike Doty who was kind of beat poet / rapping / singing over it and playing some guitar, and then you had the sample thing, and it was just that it was full on. I mean, it came at you.
Yeah.
I mixed a couple of live shows for them. Right after the record, they were playing CMJ in New York, and so I had to be in New York for something anyway. So I actually mixed a couple of live shows. I mixed at CBGB's. I mixed at in 2 other places, and it was great to do those shows. I mean, it was the same dudes. I mean, there's the same amount of fire, and it was super, super fun to do.
So Rockstars, just a perspective on the samples thing. I think today when you hear somebody say samples, we just automatically think about loops that you drag over from the loop bin in GarageBand and Logic. And it was much more interesting than that. These were like samples of, seagulls crying in the sky, coming soaring over the chorus of a song and stuff like that. Just really thinking out of the box and creatively.
And musical phrases though too. I mean, there was the Andrew Sisters thing in one of the tunes.
Right.
There was an old blues singer in another tune, and animals and all kinds of crazy stuff.
Awesome, man. Awesome.
Yeah, it was super fun.
Since you bring up live stuff and mixing live sound, why don't you talk for just a moment if you have any thoughts to share about, what it means to be an engineer in the studio versus being an engineer for live sound?
Well, first of all, live sound engineers should need a license to use a subwoofer. Subwoofers have killed live music.
Yeah.
Because people don't know how to use them musically at all. No, I take that back. I went to an outdoor festival recently, well, actually last year, and the guy who mixed for Lucas Nelson did an amazing job. When he walked away, I even grabbed him and I says, "You're the only good sounding act that I've heard at this stage." I mean, some guy had the meters up there playing and he had subwoofers on.
That's hilarious.
I went and saw Michael McDonald play last year at a theater here in LA. I didn't hear the bass the entire night. All I heard was the subwoofer. It's Michael McDonald. Why is there a subwoofer?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of live sound guys tend to just put the subs of the kick in the subwoofer.
Yeah, which is totally
the entire song.
Yeah, it's not musical, and there's no reason for it.
Instead of just saying, how we don't like it, let's describe why it's not musical. Why is it not musical to have a huge sub presence of the kick drum? Because somebody might make the argument, but it's there, it's in the sound. How is it not musical?
Well, because it's not decaying at a rate that decays with the rest of the music, and even naturally with the bass drum as you would hear it, right? What you're doing is you're overemphasizing this one particular frequency area of a drum, and okay. In my opinion, and what I like to hear about music is music is as much about the space that's created as it is about the notes that are being played, right? So there's this sway, there's this give and take that happens in a really great performance, right? And all of my favorite records have it. So I know I'm going to jump back and forth here between records and live for a second, but why is it that the records can feel a certain way, and then you go to see a live show and all the front of house person cares about is you getting kicked in the chest with the bass drum? And so that's not musical to me. That's not even fun. All that is to me, it's just tiring at the end of the night. When I was a kid, I used to go see shows and I would be energized. I'd be up for hours after going to see a band. And now I dread going to shows because I'm just going to be disappointed most of the time, because people are not thinking about the feel of the music, and they're not thinking about how it all interacts. And you know, and it's got to be frustrating for the bands too, to be up there on stage and people aren't moving or people aren't really excited, and you know, until they play one of their hit songs, and then suddenly, and that's because people know the tune. So you're not garnering a new audience. You're not presenting your new material in a way that people are going. You're not inviting people in with a subwoofer. You're pushing people away, or you're trying to create some physical sensation instead of an oral sensation, which is what we should be doing.
Now, we're not talking about the acts that are up there that are supposed to have a huge subwoofer. We're not talking about the bass nectars and the trap bands and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, stylistically, that's the thing. But those arrangements also, from a musical standpoint, are built with that stuff in mind.
Right, exactly.
Okay. The Foo Fighters, it's not built. The Foo Fighters aren't building their records with subwoofers in mind. Right. So why have a blaring subwoofer?
Yeah.
Makes no sense to me. Michael McDonald, the same thing, you know. Why is there a blaring subwoofer? And to the point where you don't hear the bass. And like a Michael McDonald thing, you would think it's about the vocal and about the bass and about, you know, the bass is a driving force for a lot of his records. And I sat there all night and I didn't hear it.
Yeah. Even just when you're thinking about drums, rock stars, the kick and the snare, some songs and productions, when you go look closely at it, you realize that the snare is a bigger deal than the kick. And in other ones, the kick is a big deal. And it's one of those struggles that, I have to go through when I'm mixing and I'm trying to figure out what to do. And I might push the kick up too much and then realize in the end that the reason I don't like the song and the mix that I'm creating is because I emphasize the kick. And that's putting emphasis on the 1 and the 3 on a backbeat song when the emphasis needs to be on the 2 and the 4 of the backbeat to feel right.
But it's not just that. I'm actually talking about the decay of the instrument. And that is the thing that people do not think about anymore, especially in a live context. And that is the real key, right? Because you want things to breathe. You don't want that low end to overhang and decay over everything else that's going on. I've been working on this cool project with some friends of mine, and they're doing like yacht rock writing. And it made me go explore a lot of these records from the late 70s. So like Ambrosia and Player and Pablo Cruz and these bands, right? That I only had a little cursory kind of knowledge of. But you listen to them and the bass drums on these records, they're super loud, but they're tight. There's not a lot of low end. There's a lot of click and a lot of punch. The snares are not emphasized on a lot of them. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And it was definitely a style, like an LA style for a little bit. But again, like it's a lot of attack on the bass drum. And it's dead and it's short. And the bass is what's kind of taking up the deep stuff.
Yeah. And
because the bass is playing with some motion and there's no subwoofers on it, you actually hear the space between the notes, but yet it's full.
All right, let's jump to another instrument.
Mm-hmm.
You also did a record for Mitchell Froom, an all piano record, and it reminded me to ask you about recording the piano. It's one of those surprisingly difficult instruments to record well because, kind of like a drum set, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. How do you like to, or what are some of the ways that the rock stars should remember are useful for recording a piano, whether upright or grand?
Well, okay, so let's look at grand piano first, and then let's look at two contexts. If you're looking at a more pop record, or if you're looking at a more modern kind of thing, if it's going to be a pop record or rock record, that kind of thing, you want attack, right? And you want distinction of the notes because you want to make sure it cuts through a mix, right? So my piano thing is a variation on what I learned from watching Kevin Killen. So I always put a large diaphragm condenser up near the hammers, and I always do it E above middle C. And then I get the low mic down as far as a stand will allow. But I always make sure it's on the same plane as the other one in relation to the hammers. So in other words, one isn't farther back on the strings. I make sure that they're both over the hammers, or whatever distance they are from the hammers is the same. And that gives me a beautiful image. And when the player goes up above middle C, then obviously we get a little bit more imaging to the right. Mm-hmm. When they're playing in the middle, for some reason, it gives me a really nice bounce. And it feels stereo, but it doesn't feel like I'm being wrapped around it too much. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people go for hyper stereo, and it feels like you're just in the middle of the record, as opposed to feeling like you have a little distance or you're sitting in front of it a little bit.
Okay. All right, cool.
So that's my kind of pop or kind of standard piano.
So let me say that back to you a little bit. Mm-hmm. The large diaphragm mic is kind of up towards the hammers, and it's up above. It's looking down at the E above middle C. Mm-hmm. And then
that's where the high mic is.
That's the high mic. And then the other one is also large diaphragm or not?
Yeah. And I use the same mic for both of them. I actually like to do that. I mean, I've seen people do all kinds of things, right? So sometimes there's a 47 FET and a 414, and then they mic the low strings down on the other end of the piano. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it.
Yeah.
But there's a time when I was doing a lot of set it up, record 3 or 4 tunes, break it down kind of things. So I had to come up with a technique that was consistent and that was reliable for me. And that actually is what I ended up coming up with.
So now where are we putting our second low mic again? It's still up near the hammers, but
it's up near the hammers. Well, it really depends on the mic stands available. Okay. Because you have to find a mic stand that will go into the grand piano enough, right, to get over the low strings. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's more important that the mics are sitting in the same plane than that I'm miking the lowest strings.
Right.
For some reason, I found that actually makes more sense than if I just stuck the mic over the low strings and didn't really worry about it.
Now, what about checking for mono compatibility if these mics are going to be panned out? Is there anything that you're listening for that clues you in that the low mic is in the wrong spot or anything like that?
I have to say it's been pretty lucky for me. Obviously, yeah. I mean, if you put it in mono and if you starts feeling phasey and comey, then you got to move something. I mean, that should be pretty obvious to our rock star friends.
Right.
This technique, I've had more problems when the microphone is off the hammers, the low microphone is off the hammers, than on the hammers, with it feeling like it's in phase, which makes sense because in some ways, because the attack plane, if you will, how's that a catchphrase? The attack plane. So the hammers are all kind of in the I mean, it's the way I'm looking at it is that the hammers are all, how can I put this? If I keep the mics at the same height, and if they're in the same plane that the hammers are on. I'm sorry, I'm talking with my hands here. Sorry,
right.
Rockstars, you can't see it. This is partially my Italian and partially just me trying to visualize and explain it, because I haven't really, it's so much easier to explain when you can actually see a piano.
Right, totally.
So, but that's kind of, yeah. So that's that aspect. But now I just did something the other day for somebody who wanted me to record his upright and him singing at the same time. He's like, oh, I really got to do it on my upright. I love my upright. So I grabbed my Apollo and I grabbed a Royer R10 and I grabbed a Lawton LA120. So small diaphragm 451 style condenser mic, a figure 8 mic. And I did an MS recording with it. And it worked out really well. And I hadn't done that in ages because MS can sound swimmy sometimes. But we didn't really have the space to do a spaced cardioid thing. Plus, I was concerned he was singing at the same time, so I wanted maximum rejection. So the figure 8 is sideways, right? So we know that's going to be our maximum rejection. Plus, he's singing into the back of the cardioid mic.
Right.
And it worked out really, really well.
Very cool. How close was the voice to those mics, and how awkward is it to get the mic stands in position and all that?
Well, it's funny because my first question for him is, do you have mic stands? And he said, yes, but I got over there and there were all these round base stands. So if you put too much weight on an extension, the mics are going to fall over, right? But fortunately, he had a drum mic clip, or one of those drum things. You clip it onto the mic, but it's got this arm and then you can adjust the arm. So I was able to get that onto the same stand as the figure 8 mic. So I was able to get this nice little thing. I'll send you a picture of it. I've got a picture that I took. And so I was able to do that with one stand. And then I just brought the vocal mic in on another stand. And the vocal mic was about, it wasn't that far. It's an upright. So it was like 2.5 feet away.
Okay,
and
cool.
it worked out pretty well. I mean, it's not perfect. Yeah, there is some bleed, but it sounds
But it's copacetic
reasonable
bleed.
and usable. Yeah, exactly.
I haven't said the word copacetic in quite a long time, actually.
All right.
What did you choose for a vocal mic in that case?
I used this Violet mic that I have. It's called a Globe Vintage, and it's basically a U47 style capsule with solid state electronics. And I've used it on this guy before, and I know it sounded good on his voice. And so it's 47 FET-ish. Maybe it's a little bit brighter, a little bit more present than what you would think a 47 FET sounds like. But
all right, cool. Awesome. All right, so let me jump forward here. Hillary Bergen and Truth and Salvage Company. Those are a couple of artists that you work with. They both are bands that might have really smooth, detailed picked acoustic instruments, guitars, mandolins, stuff like that. And I wondered if you could talk about how you like to record acoustic strummed instruments for a clean, detailed sound.
Okay. Well, Truth and Salvage, I just mastered. I didn't do any of the recording on that. But the Hillary Bergen thing, that's me playing. And
nice.
And I played all the instruments on there except the drums.
Very cool.
And that, this is kind of one of my little secret weapons. That's an AKG D19 on the acoustics.
Okay.
But here's the thing about D19s. There's actually 2 D19s on there. There's an AKG and then there's a Telefunken. And they have different diaphragms in them, I found out. The AKGs have a thinner diaphragm, so it's a particular sound. The off-brand D19s have a thicker diaphragm, and they sound a little bit more brittle and a little bit more shrill. They're not as musical sounding as the AKG versions. But as a doubling mic, it's actually pretty cool. So on that particular record, it's just D19s on the acoustics. And I think I played a Gibson Hummingbird on it.
Cool. Great guitar.
And, but I like KM86s on them a lot. The other thing I do sometimes is, there's that standard thing that most people do where you take the your main mic and you put it at right about the 12th fret or about where the neck meets the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a reasonable guitar sound. But the other thing I like to do is sometimes I take a 57 and I point it at the body,
Mm-hmm.
down at the bottom, and I just EQ it to be all mid-rangey.
And that's sort of back behind the bridge just a little bit, down bottom.
Behind the bridge and down at the bottom. Yeah. Yeah. It's literally at the bottom bout of the guitar. If you had like, if the guitar was like a Les Paul shape and you know, where the jack is on a Les Paul,
mm-hmm.
it would be just a couple of inches up above that. And so I take off all the top end and all the bottom end and I just leave it mid-rangey. And so I'll record the two mics and then I'll, honestly, if I'm not doing it myself and if I'm not in headphones, if it's actual session, I'll just commit. I'll just blend the two till I get the sound I like and then just record it. And then that's it. It's done. So
two mics spaced out, but they're going to be a mono sound in the end.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
So it's like a pretty and then an ugly blend in. And in some ways, it's like that philosophy with the drums, right? With taking that compressed, funky mic and blending it in with the more pristine mics. And it just, for me, gives it a more realistic sound.
And you might compress the 57 blended back in with the KM86?
I'll compress both of them at the same time, usually through an LA3A, which is my favorite compressor, and then go right to tape with it or right to Pro Tools with it.
Very cool. And then Rockstars, it kind of gave me an idea too, which is which maybe you don't need to do if John's already explained how to get that just right sound. But if you are wanting to experiment with different mic positions and moving things around, you know, John, you talked about moving a mic a little bit and it sounds different, is maybe just set up a video camera, like an iPhone on yourself, and then just start recording and just try moving the mics around and trying different stuff and listening in headphones and see what sounds cool so that later you can go back and you're like, oh, I loved it. You know, 15 minutes in, that was amazing. What was I doing? And it might be an easy way to like, you know, kind of go back and see it again.
That's a great idea. Definitely. See, thinking about technology.
You gotta use it. It's your friend.
It is.
Any other thoughts? What about mandolins? How often do you record mandolins and violins and fiddles and stuff?
Not all that often, but you know, a lot of it's instrument dependent. And the other thing I want to say too, I mean, acoustic instruments in general, right? I mean, if you're playing a Taylor or if you're playing, talk acoustic guitars for a second, right?
Sure.
Taylor in general is going to be way brighter than say an old Martin or a Gibson or something, right? So again, context will dictate what you use on that instrument, right? If it's a bright, splashy pop rock or pop country thing, then and you have a Taylor, then maybe you want to use a brighter microphone to kind of have it cut. So then if you end up with like a 451 or a 452 or a 414 even, right? But if it sits right in your mix, that's the important part. Would I use that on a Neil Young style thing? Absolutely not. You know, I'd probably opt for like a Hummingbird with a KM86 or you know, or a KM53 or 54. You know what I mean? So 53s and 54s are old tube mics, right? Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of good modern kind of equivalent things. You know, so, or sometimes even a dynamic mic on an acoustic. Like I said, the D19. I found out the D19s were used a lot on the White Album. A lot of the acoustic guitars on the Beatles' White Album were D19s.
What is the D19? Is it a dynamic mic?
It's a dynamic mic. When you see old Beatles photos, it was the Ringo drum overhead, not the Coles, but the kind of smaller, almost like a pencil-looking mic that you would see over the Beatles drum kit.
Okay. For some reason, I thought that was the EV635, but
no, the 635 is it's an Omni version almost of an RE15, which is also a really killer microphone. 635As are awesome.
Is that a good mono drum mic?
It's a great mono drum mic.
Yes. Yeah. I got two of them.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. You got to try it.
I can record all my mono drum mics in stereo. All right, cool, man. Great. Awesome insights into this stuff.
But just quickly to answer, you know, for like violins, mandolins, things like that. violin, I've used recently a Royer R10 and really loved it. I've never been a huge ribbon fan, but that microphone is really, really good. And then mandolins, again, like if you an R10 from behind, or even a ribbon mic from behind, because a lot of ribbon mics on the back end, the frequency response is different than the front. You know that, right? I know you know that.
No. Tell us. Tell us.
Due to the physics of the ribbon and how it's mounted, usually the back of a ribbon mic will have a slightly different frequency response than the front. And usually that translates to having a little bit more presence. And for someone like me who likes presence, who likes feeling, that I'm feeling all that detail and hearing all that detail, turning the microphone around can give you a different sound. Obviously, if you're combining it with other mics, you got to obviously make sure you flip the polarity.
Right, yeah. Well, that's a trip. So if my Coles 4038 seems a little too dark on the drums and I'm wanting to brighten it, I might just flip it around backwards.
Right. Although with the Coles, you have to be careful because of the way that it's mounted. Mm-hmm. But that would be an interesting experiment. I've never tried it with the Coles, but I've done it with the Royers. I've done it with the old RCA mics. I've done it with it used to be the Chicarelli and Trip, and now Shure bought them, and I don't remember the model number, but there's a black mic with a red grill, and that one sounds really cool on the backside too.
Oh, cool. All right.
Yep.
Well, groovy. All right. Well, that's a great tip. Something brand new there, even though we were supposed to know it already.
Well, I mean, we can't know everything, and that's why these podcasts, this is why what you're doing is so cool, right? Because you're just talking to people and stuff's coming up. And, I listened to several of these, and I listened to Vance's most recent one, and it was kind of funny just to hear a couple of his takes, and it just gives you stuff to think about, which is why this is so cool.
Well, we really appreciate you being here, John. Thank you so much. Another artist that you worked with is Roger Manning. You've done a few things with him. What do you enjoy about synth music? What are some favorite thoughts that come to mind for you? And, what have you learned about making great synth records?
Well, Roger's really interesting in that he's loves old records, but he likes trying to take it and kind of put a spin on it in an interesting way, right? Sometimes it's just out of humor. His most recent record, he's got a tune that's called "I'm Not Your Cowboy," but it's a take on Elton John's record "Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy." I think that's what the record's called, right? So the song is a weird kind of answer to an Elton John style, and stylistically, it even sounds like "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me" or one of those classic Elton John tracks. So he puts things together in a really interesting way. So his records, when they show up, are always fun because it's like I never know quite what's going to come out. He likes using samples. He likes using loops. And then he also puts a lot of vocals on them as well. So that kind of stuff is super fun and challenging because trying to get into his head and what he's hearing, sometimes I get it right away. And then sometimes it's like, and I got to go back and I got to do a little studying because sometimes his references are pretty specific to like a certain record or a certain period. And so it's always a great learning experience with Roger. And he's such a fun guy to hang out with because he's really knowledgeable and super musical.
So you don't just crank up the subwoofer to get it right?
You know what? If all anybody gets out of this is John Paterno hates subwoofers, I think that's fine with me.
It's a win. It's a win-win for all of us. That's great, man. Well, so those are situations where you're mixing, right? If he's bringing you a project that's already got a lot of stuff.
Exactly.
What are some thoughts for you about, I'm just going to guess that there's a lot of musical information in those tracks too. What are some thoughts for you about mixing records when people bring them to you? What are the, I had a question written down, but I can't find it. How do you approach a record when you're going to mix it? How do you manage a whole bunch of tracks too?
Well, what's cool is it's really wide open. I do things for Pure Mix. I'm one of their mentors, and they have a series right now where they're giving a bunch of people the same song, and we're all mixing it, not having heard the tune before.
Cool.
So, so it's a really interesting study. And so basically you get a tune and hopefully they have a rough mix. And so you listen down, and the first thing you're listening for is the arrangement. At least me, the first thing I'm listening for is the arrangement. Is everything in place? Am I engaged with what I'm hearing all the way through? Because then that'll inform, do I need to spice stuff up a little bit, or do I go with what's there? It's basically, is it more of a balancing thing and bringing out the excitement of the record, or is it, do I have to create things? And this is where my Tchad influence comes in as well. It's just like, I have no problem taking a sound and doing whatever I have to do to it. I'm not beholden to anything that's there. So some things come in and they just need work. Either the drum sounds are bad, or a lot of times, whoever put the record together, in our modern age where people get, the drummer gets the tracks and he does his thing, and then the guitar player gets the tracks and they do their thing, and stuff gets passed around, but nobody's thinking about the record as a whole and how it gets put together. So it's usually pretty easy to tell when you listen to the rough mix, what that's like. If someone's thought about the record or if they've just thought about the parts. Mm-hmm. So when they've just thought about the parts, then I got to think about turning it into a record. And so then it becomes a lot of processing and running through my outboard gear and, putting a sound on things, or at least a perspective on things. But certain records, like I mixed Steve Porcaro from Toto. I mixed his solo record a few years ago. His arrangements were fantastic and everything was there. I mean, I did a lot of cool things to it, but it was all subtle. It's not like I had to kind of turn it into something. You could tell it was already there and it was all fleshed out. Roger's kind of the same way, but there are a few other things that I've gotten that I've kind of taken some liberties with, or I've kind of just, I've just kind of gone for it. And, I don't play on records very often. Every once in a while, if I hear a part and it just needs to be there. Sometimes it's percussion, like it's screaming for a tambourine. It just needs to happen. So I'll just put it on. And when I send a ref to the artist, I say, I put a tambourine on it. It happens here. If you don't like it, I'll take it off immediately. And no one's ever said take it off.
They're like, and free tambourine overdub.
Yeah, exactly. But I can't sit there and listen to the record over and over again and just feel this hole. I just want it to be good at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's reinventing the sound. Sometimes it's reamping the guitars. Like I've been doing this thing with the aux by UA where I've been taking a guitar sound, and instead of EQing it and compressing it, even if it's already distorted, sometimes it just needs that tone. Mm-hmm. And I'll just run it through one of my favorite guitar amps and into the aux and re-record it back in. And then that'll be my guitar sound. And then you get this added bonus of processing it at the same time.
Why don't you take a moment and describe what the aux is? How does that thing work?
Okay, the aux is a really cool speaker load box and with DSP in it. And the DSP in it simulates speaker cabinets. And it's a really cool system, and they've taken a lot of time. So you have a choice of speaker cabinets. You have a choice of microphones, 2 microphones, close mics that you could combine in any way you want, on axis or off axis. You can EQ each microphone. There's a room channel where you can actually bring up an ambience as well if you want to put some room sound on it. There's some extra processing like delays and reverbs and things that I usually don't use in this context. But it's really cool. So like I've got a guitar sound and it sounds like they want it to be through a Marshall cabinet, but yet it's kind of fizzy and kind of weird. So I can take that sound and I can run it through an amp. And even if the amp's clean, but I'm still getting a bit more tone. And then I can choose a Marshall cabinet that sounds good. And maybe it's a darker cabinet or a darker one that I've kind of configured.
Meanwhile,
And
you're
then
hearing it through a speaker in your own studio as well, or not even going to a speaker?
Well, it comes out my studio monitors. It doesn't come out an amp speaker at all. So we have the load box, so that takes care of the amplifier speaker, and then it goes through this DSP, and then it's simulated. It's basically a speaker emulation, a really fancy and really cool speaker emulation.
Is it tricky to get from Pro Tools, if you're using that, into your guitar amp and then to the aux box, or is it designed to make that easy as well? Well,
I use the same method that if I was going to use a guitar pedal on, right? So it's basically a reamp device, and I love the Little Labs products. So he's got an old box called a PCP.
Oh yeah,
right?
Those are great.
Yeah, so basically when I do pedals, I use the PCP. So what that does is it bumps the signal from +10 or +4 down to -10. So I plug in my pedal there, and then the PCP has a line level DI. So basically when I plug into the DI again, it comes up line level, and I just record it back into Pro Tools. And that's usually my method. But with the aux, what I do is I come out of the PCP, that bumps me down to guitar level. I plug into the guitar amp, and then the output of the guitar amp goes into the aux, and then the aux has a line level output. And from there, I actually go into one of my Chandler Neve modules into the line input. And then if I want to EQ it a little bit there, or if I want a little bit extra tone, then the Neve module is great for that. And then I record that back in, and then I mute the original track, and I just use the thing I've re-recorded. So
it's this really, I mean, it takes a couple of hooking things up, but once you got it there, all you do is you just take an existing guitar track, drop an insert on it, and now you're sort of making adjustments over there until it sits in the mix and print it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I go direct out to it. And at that point I'm mixing. So there's usually delays and stuff like that. So I'm experienced enough to kind of know what I want it to sound like, and I can get it close enough to where I usually don't have to compare it to the track too much. I mean, well, I've been doing this a long time, as you have as well, right? So you can use your imagination. But yeah, popping it on an insert is a great way to do it. And then once you commit it, or once you decide this is the sound you want, then you can just record it back into Pro Tools. And that's what I do. I always re-record back in. I always move forward.
Yeah.
I rarely use hardware inserts for that very reason.
Okay, cool.
I don't like the kick sound. I'm going to re-record it. I'm just going to print it back in, because what's great about digital EQ is the fine tuning aspect of it. You know what I mean? So I can put something on there and it's a little too pinched in this area. Well, digital EQ is perfect for that.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, another thing I noticed about you is you have some mastering credits as well. How did you transition into doing any mastering, and what do we need to know about mastering versus mixing?
Well, I got into mastering because I was mixing some low budget records for some people, and we got done, and it was just like, okay, well, I'm going to get my friend to master this for really cheap. And they did it, and it just wasn't the record that I sent. It just wasn't at all.
Yeah.
So it really bummed me out, and I'm just like, fortunately it was a test. I said, I was smart enough at the time to say, well, just have them do one. Because I thought, okay, maybe I'll just get one of my mastering friends to do it. Maybe they'll do me a favor. But there was like no money, and I didn't want to insult anybody. So I'm just like, well, let me just take a stab at it. And I did it. And I was pleasantly surprised with how it came out. Artist was really happy. At the end of the day is all that matters. And then a few people heard this record, and then I started getting calls to master. And I don't do it all that often. It's not a regular part of my business. And there are people out there who are really great at it, right? Who can really turn it into something. At the end of the day, for me, it's about feel. And I want to preserve the feel of the record that I work so hard on while mixing. And there are some very, very good mastering engineers out there, but there are also some who, it's like the subwoofer thing. It's like their concerns are not about the music or the feel as much as the level and being competitive and all that other shit. And I could give a shit about being competitive. I just want to make records that I want to hear again, or that other people want to play again. Right. I mean, and essentially at the end of the day, I just want to be Bob Ludwig when I grow up. That's the other thing too, because he is the best engineer of our generation, as far as I'm concerned. Because he just gets the feel right. Yeah. In a way that nobody else does.
What are some tools that you find useful in the mastering process?
It's funny. I like broad, here's the thing, at least for me, for mastering, right? There's the broad strokes and then there's the fine tuned stuff. So for broad stroke stuff, I still like hardware for that. I've got a Chandler curve bender, and I've got a Dangerous Bax EQ, and they're both chained one after the other. And the Chandler has the transformers in it, right? So it has a tone to it. The Bax is just really broad and open and really beautiful sounding. So to generally shape the tone of a record, that's kind of where I go. But sometimes you get stuff, and again, it's like stuff shows up, and it's like, is it all there, or do I need to bring something to the table to turn it into something?
Right.
And so when I need to turn it into something, then it's just like, then there are some things, if I need to scuff it up a little bit, then might use like the Elysia Empressor, which I love as a compressor for a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And it can be subtle. It's not just Rocco Clubbo school of compression. The UAD ATR I use a lot. I have a preset that I like to use when I mix, and sometimes that's helpful when I master as well. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's just taming things in stages. The thing about mastering for me is it's much more of a stage thing. Whereas a drum sound or a guitar sound, you might be able to go at it aggressively, but a whole mix, sometimes it takes a more subtle hand to preserve the feel of it, but yet get it to where you feel like it needs to go. And then also that subtlety makes a big difference. I use the McDSP AE600 a lot. It's one of my favorite EQs. And for some reason with that EQ, sometimes you get the right frequency and you dip at 0.3 of a dB, and it makes all the difference. Suddenly you get more dimension, you get more depth, you get more, it just does something.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think that small of a change would make a difference, but it does.
What sort of monitors do you like to be listening to when you're making these decisions?
Well, I go back and forth between a couple of different things. Right now, I'm in NHT mode. I've got these NHT monitors that aren't made anymore, unfortunately. A set called the M00s, and with the sub, and then I have these older ones even called A20s, and they have a separate subwoofer system as well. I discovered recently that I like a lot of power behind my speaker systems, especially the big ones. And these NHTs, the main power amp's 400 watts and the sub power amp is 400 watts. So that's a lot of power for a self-powered system.
And just for clarity's sake, that doesn't mean you're cranking them up super loud necessarily. It just means like there's it's more for clarity in the tone.
Transient response. I just think they're faster. I think having that kind of reserve power behind it makes for a more accurate transient response. I also have a thing about wanting the woofers and tweeters in phase coming out of the box, but that's a subject that's very open to debate. I just discovered that I like that better as well. I also use headphones. Not a lot. I don't love listening in headphones. I know a lot of people do, but oh crap. See, I'm not even used to having headphones on, so I've hit the pop filter yet again. But I've been using this Little Labs Monitor headphone amp, and then what are these Sennheiser HD 600s?
Okay, cool.
And so those are open ear headphones. So between these three, it's usually a really good indicator of how things are going to turn out for me.
Very cool. Well, it's encouraging too, because the Little Labs headphone box and a pair of Sennheiser headphones, those are pretty accessible to anybody anywhere as well.
Absolutely. The Little Labs box really surprised me at how good a headphone system can be. And in a way, it's the same principle as I was talking about. There's a lot of juice behind it. There's a lot of gain available. There's a lot of power reserves in there so that the transient response is really, really good in it.
Nice.
And so, yeah, I've been loving it. I've been really loving it. And like I said, I'm not a big headphone fan.
What about headphones out on the floor for the band? Would you recommend a pile of these Little Labs boxes, or is there something simpler that was going to work great for the band?
Well, the band considerations versus critical listening considerations, right, are very different things. Mm-hmm. If you're out on the floor with the band, especially if you're sitting in with the drummer, you need something that's going to isolate, and you need something that's going to be able to handle a lot of SPL, because most of the time people are going to crank their headphones.
Yeah.
And then plus a lot of use, your headphones are going to get broken. I had a studio for a couple of years. I had my own place, and I went through headphones because they would just break. So these are all the considerations, right? Finding a good pair of indestructible headphones is not easy. I ended up using Shure's, and they worked out pretty well. And I still have a couple of sets. So when I do my tracking dates or when I do my remote dates, that's what I use.
Cool. I know headphones breaking out on the floor, between the musicians and the use is a big part of it. Musicians will listen very, very loudly. You're absolutely right about that. And my headphones, I don't have a fancy box out there, but I'm ready to consider, upgrades and stuff like that. I think sometimes it's a little frustrating because when you're thinking about it for your studio too, you have all these headphone mixer boxes, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's like traditional old school ways where you just take a power amp and you run it passively out to headphone boxes and do it that way.
Yep.
Or you just go on Amazon and you're like, I'll take 4 of those and have those wall wart headphone boxes delivered to you.
Well, the self cue systems are pretty cool. I gotta say, I've been using them for most of my career. Like when I came up, Henson was the first place. It used to be A&M that really committed to doing these things. And the boxes that they built in the 80s are still being used to this day, and they still work. And they're a couple of rack spaces, and they're this big honky thing, but they work. And then that Furman system, the HD. Wait, hold on. I got it right here.
That's the one with the Ethernet cables that kind of hook it all up, probably.
Yeah, there's the Ethernet cable. That's the smaller model. And then there's the bigger model that had the big 50-pin cable.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
That was the 16-channel one. Those things were amazing. And Furman stopped making them. But they were loud. You can do a lot with them. You can put a lot of channels in them. They were awesome. And then there's this newer generation of smaller control boxes with a lot of interrogation that the musicians need to use. And I'm kind of ambivalent about that, because it's a lot of like pushing buttons and mousing and distracting.
Yeah.
But it still beats having to set up a cue and having to listen to headphone mixes in the control room while people are out playing with drummers, right? It's a completely different experience. So,
well, it's a real balancing act, because here we've already described the challenge of trying to engineer and perform. And it's not very fair of us to dump that on the musicians. It's like, there's a headphone box. You'll just have to become an engineer to use it.
Well, what's a good solution I've found is that if you get a balance going quickly in the control room, send them your balance and then send them a bunch of more me knobs.
Yeah.
That or do a static cue mix from your console, right? And then this way you can still solo up in the control room and not affect the headphones. And then if they just go, okay, well, the basic balance is good, I need to hear more of something, then at least they have it on a knob. I mean, a one knob turn is not really that big of a deal.
Right.
I mean, if you have to set up your own headphone mix, that's kind of a different story. But yeah, if it's just a one knob thing, I think most musicians appreciate that. And there's a lot less of having to mess around with that,
Mm-hmm.
The only thing is sometimes singers do it. And if they go too loud, they'll start singing flat. And if they're not loud enough, they start singing sharp. So that's usually something. If the singer suddenly starts getting pitchy, then that's something to look at, is how loud are they hearing themselves in their headphones.
Very interesting. Okay, that's a great tip, because we certainly run into that at times.
Yep.
All right, let me ask one more question, and then we'll kind of go to our final and close out. Tell us what you're working on now. I know you had done something really unusual to the spoken word record with Peter Himmelman. Talk about that stuff, or what's the latest for you?
Well, so there's a couple of things that are about to come out, or that have come out in the last year or two. This Peter Himmelman thing it's a really kooky spoken word against music / ambience thing. And he and I were talking about doing a record at one point together. And he had been writing these just pieces, just these poems, I guess you will, or it's kind of stream of consciousness writing. And he'd been publishing them someplace. And I'd been seeing them like on a Facebook feed or something. And I thought they were super interesting. And he had sent me a bunch of his song demos, and I listened through all of those. And I was going to a meeting to talk to him about the song demos. And I walk in, and as I'm driving over, I'm thinking, boy, those spoken word pieces are, those pieces are really cool. Maybe we can do a spoken word thing, And I show up, and the first thing he says, he goes, "What do you think about working on those pieces, those writings I've been sending you?" And I'm like, "I would love to." And so that was the impetus of it. And so I started taking the words and just trying to come up with concepts and a vibe behind it. And sometimes it's musical, sometimes it's not. Only two of the pieces have real, like a rhythm to it, like a drum machine or a drum feel. Some of them, the rhythm comes from other places. Some of them, there's not really rhythm at all. It's just these funny soundscapes. I don't know if you listen to any of it or not. It's a little kooky, but it was super fun to do.
What sort of instruments are you playing to create the sounds and the music for it?
Well, there's guitars and some keyboards, but there's also like a rainstorm that I recorded out in front of my house one day. I went down to the beach and recorded some of the ocean.
What do you use for remote stuff like that? What's your go-to?
I've got an older Zoom thing, and then I also have now a microphone attachment for my iPhone that's Zoom as well. It's a little stereo microphone.
Cool.
It's kind of the next generation of the handheld thing.
Yeah.
And it's fine for that. One tune has our cat was he used to purr really loud. And so I took a microphone and just recorded him purring at one point, and that ended up on there. I had a sax player come in and did sax on 2 or 3 tunes. Jeff Babco played a couple of additional keyboards, but it's mostly me. And it's weird stuff. Like I'm using like a guitar player called a Randomatic, which is really weird and messed up and pitch bendy, warbly. And
fun. So in other words.
Yeah. So I would work up these pieces and I would go over to him, and then he would just recite it against the music. So there was some basis for him to perform against, and we'd do it until it felt right. And then that was it.
Now,
and then I take it back and work on it some more.
I seem to recall you talking about doing some binaural stuff too. Was that this project or a different one?
Yeah, that was this project. So we were kind of getting done, and it's one of those things where it was just like we keep circling back to it. And I personally like want to commit to something and work on it really hard and call it done. I have a hard time with spending a couple hours on it here and then 2 weeks later, another couple of hours, right? So we got into a point where I thought it was kind of done, and then I keep hitting this pop filter. Sorry, everybody, if you keep hearing it.
It just shows how legit this interview is.
It just shows how little I have headphones on, and I'm on this side of the microphone.
Nice.
So I found this plugin. The mixes were sounding flat to me, and I just thought, Tchad Blake had done this mix one time, this song called Black Sky on the Sam Phillips Martinis and Bikinis record. And if you haven't heard it, just find it, put on a pair of headphones and listen to it. It will blow your mind. And it's kind of a binaural mix. So I kind of had that in mind, just kind of taking an element or two just to kind of stretch the record in headphones. And so that's what I did. There's a thing called Dear Reality, or I don't remember. I bought the plugin through Plugin Alliance, so you can find it on there. And there's a music version, and then there's a more expensive version. And I did the music version. And it allows you to take a point source and put it anywhere in the binaural field.
Cool.
So then with that in mind, I mixed the record doing that. So I would take one or two elements and try to pull it in front or try to put it behind. And, it worked pretty well. It kind of messed with the S's on the vocal. And in retrospect, I kind of wish I had kind of dealt with that a little bit better. But I really like the effect. And so if you listen to it, there's a couple of things. The vocal should feel like it's in front a little bit. There's a song called So Many Ways to Fall, where the piano and the horns sound like they're in front of you a little bit. So like they're off your left eye and your right eye, as opposed to them being in your left ear and your right ear. So I tried to fool around with that a little bit. And that was really a fun experiment. Cool.
And I think we put a link to those in the YouTube playlist as well. Just checking. Right. Have you listened to the binaural effect on YouTube, and should we expect to hear it there as well? Or just in case it's one of those things that you need the WAV file for, or does it work with MP3s as well?
No, I've heard it. Yeah, I heard it on Spotify. I checked it on Spotify, and I can hear it there. And
cool.
So
we'll put that link in the show notes as well.
Okay.
Groovy.
So I did that. There's a guy named Howie Payne that was really, really good. But he's more of a singer-songwriter in the like Neil Young, John Lennon kind of vein. Super fun record to do. And then this guy, Andrew Sinowick, who I mentioned earlier, that we did over the summer. He did a set at the Baked Potato, which is that kind of famous jazz club here in LA. Mm-hmm. And so many people loved the show and encouraged him to make a record out of it. That we went into a studio one night and was there for like 8 hours and cut a record.
That's great,
and I
man.
took it back here and I mixed it, and it was super, super fun to do.
How many of those hours did it take you to set up for recording?
It usually takes me about 2 hours to set up for a tracking date.
Yeah.
Of any reasonable size. Obviously, if it's a lot of players, then it takes a little longer.
Yeah.
But usually within 2 hours, I've got sounds and we're working.
Yeah.
And again, it was 2 drummers, so that was a bit of a challenge. And then just figuring out stuff and working, and I hadn't been at that studio in a while. And then there's also stuff that I couldn't touch because of other sessions that were going on. So there's a bit of a game in that end of it.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, it was fun.
Well, groovy. Well, John, thank you so much for being here on the show with us. I've got one more question. This one is hypothetical, but we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you're going to go back and find young John, maybe down in Miami, sunning on the beaches on South Beach and thinking about the right way to record. and you're going to go back and give yourself some advice, and you say, "Listen, dude, here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the recording studio yourself one day." What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
Follow your gut. Well, there's probably a couple of things. First of all, follow your gut. Always put yourself in the position of the musician. In other words, do they want to be hitting the kick drum a million times and then snare drum a million times? No, they want to play.
Yeah.
And then actually I'm going to, can I curveball this a little bit,
man.
because
it's your show.
Well, here's the thing. I talked about all these techniques I gleaned from people, right? From a couple of really great engineers. But the best thing anyone ever told me, sorry, this makes me a little sad because I never got to thank the guy. He passed away. I was having a shitty day. It was toward the end of my assisting time. And it was just, you're at a place for 4 or 5 years and it's just like frustrating.
Yeah.
And just dealing with some shit. And he saw my frustration and we got through the session and he just looked at me and he said, look, man, whatever happens, just leave the place. And he was just really kind when he said it. I have a little bit more emotion. He just said, look, man, you're obviously not having a good day. He said, but just remember, always just leave the place better than when you got it.
Nice.
And his name was Tabe Mote. And I had found out that he had died a few years after I had done this session with him. My only interaction with him, it was like a 3-hour session. And he was just really kind and he really understood and to have that kind of empathy towards the situation and towards the people, it's super cool.
Yeah.
And that, I think, there's a lot of bravado with a lot of people and you have all these people on the internet doing stupid ass shit. And it's music shouldn't be about that. Music needs to be about interaction and people and reaching people and inviting people in.
Yeah.
And if your goal is to make it better than when you got your hands on it, then you're doing it for the right reasons. So,
when I asked myself in the past about what music is, I remember coming to a realization that music is about communication between people. It's a form of human to human communication, even if it's electronic music. And I think you're just reminding me of that engineering is probably about helping that human to human communication too.
We're facilitators. That's what we do. And that is our job at our core. Production, engineering, we are facilitators. We are there to facilitate the experience, to capture the moment. And because that's the magic of records, right? The count off of the Beatles. I saw her standing there. I know I'm dating myself, but every time you hit play, that energy is there all the time. And how fascinating is that?
Yeah.
And why is that not our goal? Why is that not our goal all the time, to tap into that?
And that version of that song that you're hearing, you're not hearing the version that happened a little too early, or you're not hearing the one that happened a little too late that wasn't as good. You're hearing the one right at that peak.
Yep, exactly. And that's a whole other discussion. If you have me back again, we can talk about my theory on those Beatles records and why they're so magical.
Yeah, indeed.
But this was super fun, man. Thanks. I can't believe I got a little choked up there. So sorry. That's not usually my MO.
I appreciate you bringing your honesty and your heartfelt feelings about all this stuff. So thank you so much for being here.
It's important. Yeah, I just really hope things get better. Not get better. I just hope that that people. All right.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks.
That last little bit. Okay.
Hold on. Let me drop the marker there too.
Thank you,
John. Let the rock stars know how they can find you online. Where should they go? Stay connected with you, follow you and your music.
Okay, so the website is the easiest one. I've got 2, but they both point to the same place. JohnPaternoMusic.com will get you to the website. My Instagram is at Paterno Dafaj. So it's PATERNODAFOZ.
What is Dafaj?
Okay. I'm not Portuguese, but Dafaj is a Portuguese word for mouth. And what it really means in practical language there, it's the estuary. It's where the river meets the sea.
Oh, wow.
So my concept for my website, my production company, it's called Music Dafaj. And because that's what to tie back into what we were just talking about, that's kind of how I see what it is we do, right? We help artists get from the river out to the sea, out to the big part, out to the world. So So I just stuck the Dephage onto my name just to have it be a little bit more unique. It's probably just weird and people don't get it, but
that's cool.
I like it. So
all you have to do is ask.
Yep, there you go.
Groovy.
Story for everything.
well, John, thank you again so much for being here on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. It's an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to see you again in person out in LA, or if you come to Nashville, come visit. And hopefully we make a record together at some point.
Same here. That would be fantastic. And thank you to all you rock stars for listening. And I really appreciate it. Have a great one.
All right, man. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. Also, remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with these weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free mixing course at mixmasterbundle.com. Look for the link in the show notes. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio, all totally free. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.